The bell tolls at midnight. Greetings. I'd like to welcome all of my midnight marauders. Come on in, get comfy, and lend me your imagination. They say that you can't choose your family, and with that comes all that you inherit from them. For Agasa LeBlanc, that means inheriting powerful abilities that he must learn to master, and dark forces that he can never seem to outrun, wanting to take those powers from him. I resume this midnight tale with our third entry, Perils of the Dynamic, Part 3, The Shaman. Agasa laid awake as the fireplace illuminated an old clock hanging on the wall near the old leather recliner. It was 12:45 a.m. and the bunker was silent. Rebecca and Bailey were fast asleep. Agasa eased out of bed quietly and walked over to an old wooden shelf that a surveillance monitor set on and pulled back the dusty white cloth covering it. He looked closely at the monitors, focusing hard on each of them, but seeing nothing that would cause him to be alarmed. Agasa then focused his attention on finding his duffel bag with all of his important identification information he had stored inside of it, knowing that making it to California wouldn't be possible without them. He didn't see his duffel bag anywhere in this dimly lit room, as he scoped out every inch of the area by the light of the fireplace. Agasa also noticed that his shoes weren't near his bedside anymore, although he remembered seeing them there the day prior. He thought about Rebecca excusing herself into one of the back rooms yesterday when she matter-of-factly told him of her decision for him to remain at the bunker indefinitely with her and Bailey. Agasa knew he had to find his identification card, passport, and other vital information that Rebecca now had in her possession. He quietly tried pulling open the old wooden door of what he presumed to be an ammunition cabinet, hoping Rebecca had mistakenly left it open, but no such luck. It was locked. "Damn," Agasa whispered under his breath as he stood at the cabinet, trying to think of a way to jimmy the lock without destroying it. Ultimately, he knew he had to find the keys to this cabinet because there was a good possibility that his duffel bag was locked inside. Suddenly, Agasa heard footsteps and quickly hurried back to his bed, pulled the covers up to his chest, and laid there motionless as Rebecca peeped around the corner, then walked up to Agasa's bedside and oddly enough just stood there looking down at him for what seemed like an eternity to Agasa. Rebecca then walked over to the surveillance system and noticed that the cloth was pulled back, exposing the monitors. She hesitated for a few seconds, not knowing if she'd left the curtain open herself, or perhaps Bailey had forgotten to close it the day prior. Agasa cracked his eyelids as he watched intently, feeling a bit uncomfortable about the way Rebecca was moving around the room, checking the surveillance system in the dark. Agasa closed his eyelids tighter as Rebecca came back to his bedside to check on his breathing, leaning so close that he could actually feel her breath on his cheek. Rebecca began to walk out of the room, and Agasa felt a chill as she looked back towards his direction while walking towards the main hallway of the bunker. Agasa began to feel like his decision to leave the bunker might not be as easy as he thought, but decided that whatever happened, he was willing to do whatever it took to make sure he kept his promise to Mama Angel to get to his family in California. The next day, Agasa woke to the clink of pots and dishes being moved about in the sink and noticed Rebecca stirring around in the kitchen. Agasa sat up in bed and said, "Good morning, Rebecca." She turned with a smile, replying, "Good morning, Agasa. How are you feeling?" Agasa responded, "Oh, I can't complain." Agasa added, "Is there anything I can help with?" Rebecca answered, "Thanks for offering, but I'm all done here," as she finished wiping off the kitchen countertops. Agasa noticed Bailey wasn't in the room and asked, "Hey, where's Bailey?" Rebecca answered, "She's gone with Carl to stock up on more food, medicine, and a few more warm blankets for a nice and cozy long winter's stay." Agasa thought Rebecca's mention of a cozy long winter's stay was rather unusual, but continued the conversation saying, "Wow, I didn't even hear Bailey leaving." Rebecca continued straightening up the kitchen, something obviously troubling her. Agasa then asked, "How does one exit this bunker?" "Just in case Carl and Bailey need a hand with the stock up." Agasa looked curiously at Rebecca as she began to tell Agasa how to exit the bunker, when all of a sudden a green light began flashing on and off on a handheld remote Rebecca had sticking out of her overall top pocket. Upon receiving this alert, Rebecca pressed the flashing button and Agasa heard a door opening as Rebecca quickly walked towards the bunker hallway. Agasa eased out of bed and inconspicuously followed Rebecca as he watched her step onto an automatic lift as it elevated her up to an opening at the top of the bunker. He heard Carl and Bailey's voice and knew that this, in fact, was the way out. Agasa realized he had to get his hands on that remote in order to leave the bunker. Agasa hastened back to his bed and threw on an unassuming smile. As Rebecca, Bailey, and Carl re-entered the main room of the bunker, Rebecca noticed Carl looking at Agasa as she formally introduced him. Carl walked over to Agasa and greeted him with concern, trying to read Agasa's first impression. "Hey, Agasa, is it?" Agasa retorted. "Hey, nice to meet you," as he held out his hand, shaking Carl's as he asked Agasa, "How are you doing? You were pretty banged up there. You're lucky you walked into the right gas station when you did, or from what I've been told, things could have really taken a turn in the opposite direction. Rebecca told me about your unbelievable ordeal, like something right out of a nightmare." Agasa looked vexed, saying, "You're right. It's definitely a nightmare." Rebecca, noticing a looming display of dread show over Agasa's face, said, "Thanks, Carl. Bailey and I can take it from here." Carl walked over to Agasa, shook his hand, and oddly Agasa could feel sympathy coming from Carl's energy, disguised as a friendly goodbye, but with a sense of hope behind the handshake, as Carl quietly said underneath his breath, "I'll be in touch." Agasa knew that Rebecca had no plans to let him leave the bunker anytime soon, and began wondering about the jackets that were hanging on the coat rack, and if there was another reason they happened to be there. Rebecca walked over to Agasa and handed him some pain pills for his sore ribs, not knowing that Agasa had no plans on taking them. He took the pain pills from Rebecca's hand as she turned to get him a bottle of water off of the table. He hid the pills in his sock, pretending he'd already had put them in his mouth. Rebecca turned back towards Agasa, handing him the water, then standing there, watching him intently as he motioned, swallowing the medication and drinking the water. Bailey, who seemed totally unaware that Agasa had hid the medication while putting away the groceries, was busy enjoying her music blaring from her headphones. With all of the stock up put away, Agasa watched as Bailey moved the bunker door remote near the centerpiece on the table and walked to the back room of the bunker. Rebecca began to prepare dinner for the three of them, with the remote just barely noticeable pushed up against a large bowl of apples on the table. Agasa, sitting up on the side of the bed, struck up a conversation with Rebecca, curious as to who the men's jackets hanging on the coat rack belonged to. "That's a nice fire you got going there, Rebecca. It keeps the temperature here nice and warm, especially since I don't have a jacket," Agasa added. Rebecca replied, I have quite a few jackets you'd, Just then, Rebecca caught herself and abruptly stopped mid-sentence. She noticed Agasa's eyes curiously trying to read what was behind Rebecca's uncomfortable pause as she turned away, walked across the room, and sat down in the old leather recliner near what Agasa presumed was an ammunition cabinet. Rebecca sighed as she looked across the room at Agasa and began to tell him a story about her late husband Neil, saying, I met my husband Neil 25 years ago at a fairground while playing one of those coin toss games to win a prize. You're supposed to land a coin into one of these glass vases. You see, if the coin landed in the vase and stayed, you won the vase. The only problem with that was I had horrible aim. Rebecca laughed as she continued. Little did I know there was someone watching this disastrous display. Up walked this tall gentleman with the most gentle demeanor I'd ever met, decked out in a Marine's uniform and the biggest smile on his face, asking if it would be all right if he gave the coin toss a try for me, and needless to say, I was relieved and didn't hesitate handing him the rest of my tokens. Agasa could see the light in Rebecca's eyes as she reminisced about the first time she met her husband Neil. Rebecca continued, adding, he took a steady aim at the biggest, most beautiful rose-colored vase that sat far back from the smaller, less expensive vases out front, which seemed to be the one he was trying to win for me. He turned around with such confidence and a steady hand, pitched the coin, and it landed directly in this giant, beautiful vase on the first try. I was just thrilled and thought, what a kind man. Long story short, we began dating, shortly after got married, and roughly a year and a half later, had Bailey and lived a pretty wonderful life. Until Rebecca paused, Agasa looked silently at Rebecca as the tears began to well up in her eyes. Rebecca continued as her voice began to crack and soften. Until the day Neil was coming home from an evening jog down a trail near our home, a trail that we both frequented, but this time I decided to stay at home and let him go alone. During the last few minutes of his jog, Neil was attacked by thieves, leaving him to die alone just a few feet from the end of the trail. All they got out of taking my Neil's life was his wedding band and an effing watch. Made no sense, Rebecca screamed loudly, crushed and furious as hell. A teary-eyed Bailey, who had obviously been listening to her mother relive this heartbreaking tragedy, peeked around the corner from the hallway, then quietly disappeared, returning into one of the back rooms. Rebecca went on to say, if only I could have been with him, I could have possibly kept him safe, as she covered her mouth with her hand, weeping. Agasa stood to his feet and walked over to Rebecca, putting his arms around her, hugging her ever so gently, letting her know he understood her pain. Rebecca, trying to pull herself together, thanked Agasa for his warm condolences, then told him about the jackets hanging on the coat rack. All of the jackets belonged to Neil. He purchased them at different stages of our life together, Rebecca told Agasa. I keep them there to comfort Bailey and I, a soothing reminder that a part of him is always around. Agasa began to fully understand why Rebecca didn't want him to leave. He knows now that Rebecca doesn't want what happened to Neil to happen to him. Although there would be no comparing the two, Agasa couldn't help but feel guilty. He refused to let Rebecca feel obligated to keep him safe. The longer he stayed in this bunker with her and Bailey, the more chance he stood of putting both of their lives in danger. Out of the corner of his eye, Agasa noticed the bunker door remote still sitting on the table that Bailey had pushed close to the fruit bowl after Rebecca opened the bunker door for her and Carl. Agasa knew he needed to secure that remote before Rebecca noticed it sitting there. Hoping Rebecca didn't see it laying there near the fruit bowl, suddenly the bunker went black. Agasa froze as Rebecca yelled, "Damn it, a freaking power outage!" "You've got to be kidding me." Just then, in true leopard fashion, a swiftly nimble-moving Agasa slid out of bed and hastened over to the table, grabbed the remote, tucked it into his pants pocket, and returned to the bed before Rebecca even noticed he had even gotten out of bed. Bailey ran into the main room with Agasa and Rebecca just as the bunker lights began to flicker and turned back on. Agasa felt as if Mama Angel was looking out for him and caused this much needed distraction. As the night progressed, Rebecca and Bailey sat near the fireplace, sharing a quiet music-filled evening with Agasa. The evening developed, and both Rebecca and Bailey, now exhausted, excused themselves to their bedroom quarters for the remainder of the night. Hours passed, and Agasa noticed Rebecca snoring, resembling that of a deep slumber, the sound of a perfect time to act emanating from the back room of the bunker. Agasa had also noticed the presumed ammunition cabinet oddly had a set of keys hanging out of the keyhole. He quietly hurried out of bed and quickly walked over to the cabinet, turning the key with success, and there on the bottom shelf sat his duffel bag. He unzipped the bag, and there lay his wallet, shoes, and clothes inside. Agasa opened his wallet and breathed a sigh of relief, seeing his ID, passport, and other important pieces of identification intact. He quickly got dressed and grabbed a few bottles of water that were left sitting on top of the table, grabbed the remote out of the pants he'd just changed out of, and noticed one of Neil's jackets laid out across the old leather recliner. He pulled back the cloth over the monitors and looked carefully, seeing nothing outside but endless widespread patches of snow. Agasa began to feel déjà vu, feeling as if someone had mapped out or set up an easy exit route just like his narrow escape from the workhouse before he was to arrive at this bunker. He was now trying to leave. He had no time to ponder on this, as Agasa knew he had to go now. He quietly walked into the dark hallway of the bunker and carefully pressed the remote as he stepped onto the hoist. His intuition told him to look down, and there stood at one of the far bunker room doors was Bailey, waving goodbye at Agasa with tears in her eyes. Agasa placed his hand across his heart, thanking Bailey, realizing she had set up his entire departure, knowing he wanted to leave. As Agasa moved up to the top of the outer bunker, he then placed the remote on the hoist and pressed the button, causing it to go back down into the bunker where Bailey could retrieve it and secure the bunker for her and Rebecca. Agasa, now completely out of the bunker and the door tightly secured, was met with a bright light from a pickup truck shining in his face as the sharp jolt of the cold air pierced his entire body like a sword. He braced himself against the cold rush of freezing wind, pressing his numb, ungloved hand against his forehead, right above his eyes to shield the blinding lights to see who was coming towards him. As the truck got closer to Agasa, he noticed it was Carl, Rebecca's late husband Neil's military buddy from the bunker, beckoning him to get inside the car and out of the blistering cold. Now it began to make sense to Agasa when he leaned in towards him before leaving the bunker, saying in Agasa's ear, "I'll be in touch." Agasa hopped inside the truck as Carl slowly drove off through the snow, hearing the loud sound of sleet crunching beneath the tire chains as they glistened under the moonlight. Agasa looked confused at Carl while saying, "Thanks, man. But why?" Carl responded, saying, "Rebecca is very kind, but she's not very good at goodbyes. Bailey and I have seen this play out before and wanted to spare her feelings. Bailey had already let me know that she was beginning to relive what happened to my buddy Neil. I'm still trying to make sense of it all." Agasa shook his head sorrowfully, expressing his condolences for Carl's loss. Curious as to their current whereabouts, Agasa said, "I can't thank you enough, man. Hey, by the way, just where in Alaska are we?" "Alaska?" Carl laughed. "We're in Wichita Falls along the nearby Oklahoma border. Please tell me, Rebecca didn't tell you that you were in Alaska? Did she really?" Carl chuckled. Agasa stared at Carl for a few seconds, shook his head and said, "Never mind, man." Carl hesitantly began to share with Agasa what Rebecca had told him, saying, "Rebecca informed me how horrified she and Bailey were when they saw that thing chasing you." Agasa looked matter-of-factly at Carl as Carl added, "I have a friend who is a shaman who lives in the Wichita Mountains. That's where you can lay low until this blizzard subsides. His name is Emboa." The stories I've heard about the sheer strength of his spiritual powers will set this so-called Dark One on a fast track back to the hell it came from. Agasa stared off in the distance as the truck's headlights showed the narrowing road ahead and asked Carl, "So, how did you hear about him?" Carl sat quietly for a few seconds, then calmly said, "Growing up in grade school, there was a boy everyone made fun of. You know, the kind of awkward loner that something just doesn't seem quite right with, you know. At school, this group of punks would tease and harass him relentlessly. So one day I saw this kid being bullied by this same group of cowardly punks and became enraged at how they took turns insulting and belittling him, throwing rocks at him and laughing as he struggled while stuttering and begging them to leave him alone. I ran over to this kid and grabbed his shirt, pulling him up from the ground where they had him face down while cursing him, and now me too for helping him. In an instant, I'd made myself an additional target. The following days were absolute hell for us. I mean, this band of cowards needed each other to feed off of, and I guess the only thing that made sense was, maybe they too could feel his unmistakable inner strength a mile away. I know, I felt it. I mean, why else would it take several cowards to go against one small guy like this? Unless collectively the whole group all added up to 1/3 of a whole turd. Agasa laughed. Carl continued saying, "But little did they know what lay ahead for their involvement in harming someone they had no clue about would ultimately destroy them, their families, and anyone and anything they held dear for generations to come." Hell, truth be told, I had no clue as to what this kind of vengeance even looked like, Agasa, until... Agasa stared at Carl, waiting for him to tell him. "Until what, Carl?" Agasa curiously asked. Carl said, "Until the rectifier was conjured." Agasa was uneasy, asking, The rectifier? What the hell is that?" Carl said, "A vengeful warrior spirit angel of destruction, sent to seek vengeance on those who take it upon themselves to come together to do harm to the innocent." Agasa felt a lump in his throat as Carl continued telling the story of how one by one the lives of these bullies began to dismantle. Everyone involved suffered unimaginable life exits in less than 10 years. One suffered for 3 years before dying of a mysterious disease no one had ever heard of. Another got into a head-on collision, instantly becoming quadriplegic, deciding to exit this life on his own terms. Another got attacked by a king cobra and succumbed to the venom in less than 3 minutes, while taking a routine stroll one beautiful summer day on a public trail. which had never happened to anyone else, while on this particular family-friendly trail. One even became a mistake in identity victim, resulting in his full conviction, then being unalived by an unstable inmate while awaiting trial. Oh, and the last and leader of this tough-as-nails group was oddly accidentally electrocuted, flipping on a light switch in his apartment. Oddly, the apartment owners found that this incident was the only one of its kind, due to a faulty light switch in the entire apartment complex. Carl gazed at the road ahead as he kept driving. Agasa sat quietly shocked, motionless, with his eyes focused on Carl, as Carl continued on saying, "You know what?" Reports noted, in every one of these tragic cases, Agasa, each one of these individuals had told a close friend or relative that they kept seeing this mousy little kid that they used to bully in grade school standing near their bed several weeks before they actually met their demise. Trippy, huh? Agasa, speechless, noticed they were at the top of the mountain, seeing a clearing where a large cabin-style sanctuary sat high on a hill, adorned with all the mystique and folklore of things that one can only imagine while falling down a rabbit hole at first sight surroundings that will certainly haunt your daydreams. Carl drove up to a large pine tree with water running near it and said, "We've arrived." Carl parked right in the front of the cul-de-sac near the front door of this huge dwelling and shut off the engine and stepped out of the car. Agasa sat quietly, and out of nowhere Carl was on his side of the car, tapping on his window, beckoning him to step out. Agasa thought it odd that there was hardly any snow around this huge cabin-style house, and the vegetation seemed to be as green as St. Augustine grass in the summer. Suddenly, a tall, lean man appeared, dressed in some sort of long white garment, with no shoes on, hair draped to his shoulders, wearing beads around his neck, and had some sort of symbol tattooed on his forehead. Carl greeted this man with a handshake Agasa had never seen before, and after he finished greeting Carl, he then began to walk over to Agasa, opened the sidecar door, and said, "Hello, Agasa. My name is Mboa. Welcome to my humble abode. I'm so glad you decided to come." Agasa exited the car as the man gently took hold of his wrist, tapping the front and back of his hand in the same odd manner he did to Carl. Agasa responded, "Hey man, thanks for having me." Mboa then said, "Shall we?" as he walked towards the large wooden front door of his huge cabin-style home. Agasa noticed symbols and writing on the front of the door and was curious, saying to himself, "What the hell is all this?" But as soon as Agasa asked the question in his mind, Mboa answered saying, "The symbols are to keep evil from entering." Agasa felt embarrassed and stunned all at once, feeling as though Mboa was some sort of mind reader. "Good Lord," said Agasa. "Is this real?" Agasa thought to himself. Without missing a beat, Mboa turned to him, smiled, and said, "Very." Agasa rubbed the top of his head, frustrated and confused. Right then and there, Agasa already knew that Mboa was reading his mind. They walked into the entryway of the house, and Carl excused himself to the restroom to freshen up from the long and weary drive. Agasa was in awe of this immaculate house with statues of gold deities and exotic plants and vines winding around them. There were large singing bowls that sat on a glass water-filled floor, with large, beautiful, and colorful fish visibly swimming beneath the surface. There were several cats surrounding Agasa, some of which were rubbing against his pant legs as he walked into the center of the dwelling. Mboa invited Agasa into this large, lower den-style room with large live cobras hanging on real fig trees that seemed to be planted directly into the floor and into the earth beneath it. Mboa said to a somewhat mesmerized yet uneasy Agasa, "Everything here is of a good nature. You have absolutely nothing to fear here. Have a seat, Agasa." Agasa sat down, still looking around the room at the wonders that beheld him in this enchanted dwelling. He looked at the shaman and said, "Who are you, mister?" The shaman responded, "I'm a descendant of old. I'm a caregiver of mankind and a student of humanity." Agasa looked confused, and Boa continued saying, "Ultimately, I'm just a man." Agasa looked at Mboa as he studied Agasa's mind through his eyes. Agasa knew he was trying to see what he was thinking, so he began playing the lyrics of an old country song to try and block the mind reading. In constant sorrow, the soggy bottom boys blared loudly in Agasa's mind. Mboa laughed and said, "I like that song." Agasa looked irritated. Mboa was waiting for Agasa to tell him about his incredible gift of being a shapeshifter, also the never-ending battle of his perilous journey, even though he already knew of his ordeal through Carl, who walked back in the room to tell Mboa and Agasa that he had to be on his way before the blizzard started coming down heavily. Agasa said, "I thought you were staying until the blizzard subsided a bit." Carl said, "No, Agasa, I told you that you would be staying until it subsided, but I've got to get back to my family." Carl walked over to Agasa and said, "You're safer here than you can ever imagine." He put his arms around Agasa, hugging him tightly, saying, "Good luck, my friend, I'll be in touch." Agasa sat back down on this furry sofa that seemed to move and shift upon him doing so. Agasa said to himself, "Get a grip, man. I must be tripping." Mboa walked Carl to the door, thanking him for getting Agasa there safely, while saying his goodbyes as a curious Agasa began to see a transparent figure moving around the room out of the corner of his eye, which caused him unease. Feeling spooked, he stood up trying to follow the transparent figure, whispering, "What the hell is that?" Carefully walking around this fascinating dwelling, eagerly searching for the transparent figure he'd seen moving around the room. Agasa then was startled as Mboa appeared right in front of his eyes and was standing inside the room after walking out of it from the opposite direction. "Hey man, how did you get over here when I just saw you walk Carl out in that direction?" Agasa asked. A boastful Mboa laughingly responded by saying, "I am here, I am there, and I am everywhere." Agasa, short on patience and feeling taunted, said, "Am I some sort of joke to you?" Mboa responded by saying, "You are whatever you want to be, Agasa." "But a joke? No, my friend. You are more dynamic than you can ever imagine." Agasa asked, "What the hell do you mean, man?" Mboa walked up to Agasa and said, "Look around and tell me what you see, Agasa." Agasa took a step back while his eyes were still locked on the shaman's eyes. He began to look around, noticing movement in everything: the table, the chairs, the sofa, the plants. Hell, even the walls seemed to be breathing. Agasa said with bated breath, "Why the hell is this happening to me?" Mboa said, "My young brother Agasa, it's not happening to you, it's happening for you. You're being called to unleash your power, Agasa. You have the ability to shift into any living thing that you want." Agasa stood stupefied by what he'd just heard, but believed Mboa completely. Mboa said to Agasa, "Like you, I was unaware of the level of spiritual powers I possessed until one day I was forced to use them. Without knowing, every single creature I imagined shifting into, I became. Every object with electricity I controlled. My energy could control any creature, any object. Like a chameleon, I rivaled even the largest to the smallest animals. From an elephant to an ant, it didn't matter. When Carl told me about you, I knew you were the last one of our kind, and we were one and the same. And these creatures known as the Dark Ones are fallen angels that were cast into the underworld for having rebelled against God, tempters of chaos, harassing the innocent and doing harm to mankind, and now they can't make amends with God. They know they stand no chance against me because I'm aware of how to use my spiritual power. They preyed upon the new and fresh, you Agasa, unfamiliar with how to utilize the total strength of your power. They were hoping to capture you and siphon your powers to be able to use them to compete with other powerful ones such as myself. But trust me, they are no match for me or you. We are as rare as they come, Agasa. I knew you were out there and that the Dark Ones would chase you right into my realm. I'm also aware you must have so many questions that need answers. But for now, you must rest, Agasa. You are Teflon here. Tomorrow, it'll be time for us to get to work, teaching you how to hone in on your most sacred powers. Agasa looked profoundly grateful as Mboa walked up to him, patting his shoulder to comfort him. Mboa walked Agasa to his room, down the most amazing hallway that seemingly illuminated specks of gold hues with every step taken. Agasa, still in disbelief of what he was just told and things he had just witnessed, was overwhelmed trying to take it all in. He then thought to himself it all made perfect sense. Why else would the Dark Ones continually stalk him, trying to siphon his energy? He walked inside his room and thanked Mboa for his hospitality, knowledge, and protection. Agasa found himself wondering if Mama Angel knew about his rare gift of being this unusual breed of shapeshifter. Agasa lay down on this furry moving bed, relaxing all of his thoughts along with his weary body. He laid there in the dark, finally feeling empowered against what he now saw as small lizards instead of dragons, while watching this room as it seemed to be breathing. But as for Agasa, he felt supernatural, and his soul was beginning to feel one with the universe.